Welcome back. To say racial tensions are high is an understatement. It's good to get the perspective of one who has worked to improve race relations his entire life, and indeed his entire career. I'm talking in this case about Wes Pratt, who is the Chief of Diversity and Inclusion at Missouri State University, been a champion for improving race relations all his life. Wes joins us tonight from his Springfield home. Wes, as we were setting up this interview, we started talking about this a couple weeks ago, and the focus at the time was on the Arbery case in Georgia. And unfortunately, since then, we've had the Chris Cooper video incident in Central Park, and then last week, George Floyd's untimely demise. Put this into context for us. Where are we in terms of a country torn apart by race?
It reminds me, I don't know if you recall, during the civil rights era, when they showed the police sticking the dogs on the black demonstrators. I mean, that was a clarion moment, I think, in the civil rights struggle. And I think this situation with Floyd and with Arbery perhaps could be that turning point where people really start to look at this issue of racism and bias and implicit bias that may be associated with feeding that sort of attitude towards particularly African-American males. It just seems to me that maybe for the first time for a lot of folks, they're starting to realize that justice is not justice. It's tragic. But I just got to think we got to be able to go to a better place. Unfortunately, my generation and perhaps generations before me have failed at addressing this issue of race and bias. And it's going to be up to, I think particularly white people to come to grips with their racism. And it's going to be up to our young people to bridge that gap and hopefully move forward, because this simply, a nation like this cannot stand. We can't stand as a nation with this sort of behaviors and conduct, and people want to look the other way or find an excuse for it. I mean, the bottom line is justice is not justice, and it's particularly disturbing.
I think if everybody looks in the mirror, they'll say, deep down, or maybe not so deep down, I've got some prejudice. I've got some tendency to behave in a racist manner. Wes, what would you say to people who are trying to work through that, as we all should be, trying to work through that bad part of ourselves?
Basically, number one, they need to understand that we all are biased. And implicit bias is a part of our total makeup. But you have to be willing to mitigate that bias. You have to be willing to look at yourself objectively and look at others objectively, and recognize that when you have a biased thought, when you have an ism thought, that what is going on. But that takes awareness, that takes knowledge, and certainly skills development. But I think, as I pointed out, flip the script. I remember when some of my colleagues, my white colleagues, would say to us during the Ferguson situation, the Michael Brown situation, they would say, well, I don't know how to relate to the students who are from St. Louis, who are African-American. And I said, well, what would you say to your child? It's no different. It's no different. If the script was flipped, how would you respond to it? You would respond to it with humanity and with some empathy. And then, you have to try to, make yourself aware. And then you have to become knowledgeable. So it's not enough to just say, well, I didn't recognize that, or I didn't know that. We know too much now. Social media, direct news, access is immediate. Something can happen in the next 5 minutes. We know it's on national news, as these incidents have been. So it's not enough to say, well, I don't understand. No, you have to try to understand. You have to make yourself understand, because if this is happening to, it's particularly if you believe that you're a human being and you have any type of humanity. To put somebody's knee on some person's neck for 9 minutes when they're already restrained, when they're no threat to you, for arguably a crime that was not a life-threatening situation. What is wrong with somebody who would just do that, and have all these other complaints in the background? What is wrong with somebody chasing somebody down who's jogging in the neighborhood and jogging in, down the street? There is something inherently wrong when someone thinks they have the power to engage in those types of behaviors. you know. And so it does cause people concern, but I think first of all you have to become aware, you then have to become knowledgeable, and then you have to develop the skill sets that are necessary to mitigate, things that you may not be even know that you have, such as that implicit bias, which everybody has. But you got to own it. At some point in time, you got to own it. And so that's why I say racism is a particular challenge. It may be a challenge to people who look like me because I have to experience its outward manifestations of it. But in order to solve it, folks, white people have to deal with, their mess. They have to deal with their biases. They have to deal with their ism. And I've had a lot of colleagues talk, well, my grandparents and my parents. And, yeah, but that's not you. That's not you. So to me, that's not an excuse.
I'm not sure if folks know this, Wes, but you have a Juris Doctor. You have a legal background. So I'm wondering your take on the legal or policy changes that have to occur to improve conditions for African Americans and other minorities in the country.
I'm going to hold law enforcement to a higher standard. I've got to. If you could take my liberty, you could take my life, and you should be held to a higher standard. But sometimes when I'm looking at the federal law, particularly in the Michael Brown situation, the use of fatal force was justified under the federal laws. Well, federal laws are established, are promulgated, and they're established. Policies are established, and all those policies can be revised or changed. But I think you have to have a reasonable standard. Will a reasonable cop, under these circumstances, reacted that way? And I don't think a reasonable police officer should be able to put their knee on someone's neck for 9 minutes until they basically are dead. I think that is our barbaric, it's archaic, and I don't think that's a reasonable. So I think you need to have a reasonable standard. But I sometimes look at some of these laws and they appear to me to be subjective. I'm placed in reasonable apprehension. I'm placed in apprehension of death or great bodily harm. How is somebody running away from you? Placing you in death, and particularly if they're unarmed. And that's why I tell young people, you have to be willing to engage the system. You have to be willing to run for office. You have to be willing, it's not enough to demonstrate. I understand the frustration. I mean, I was reading a quote from Martin Luther King about the riots and what they represent from folks who are unheard, where justice is not even a part of the equation. I get that. But at the same token, you have to engage the system. And I tell college students all the time, this is the only system you have. And the only process that you can legally change things sometimes is through that political process. Yes, it's onerous. Yes, it's in labor intensive times. But we need more people who I think are willing to do the right thing for the right reasons. And I think our political process has gotten away from serving people or representing all of the people all of the time.
Wes Pratt from Missouri State University, a longtime Springfield resident and a pillar of our community. Wes, thanks again.
All right, my friend. Take care.
And we'll be back after this.